A lawman stands in the doorway of his own jailhouse. Except tonight, he's not the one holding the keys. He's chained to the floor. Outside, in the dark, dozens of boots crunch over dry Texas dirt. These aren't outlaws come to break him out. They're the men who put the badge on his chest in the first place, and now they've come to take it back, along with his life. 29 years old, a rancher, a husband, a father, a sheriff who once held the power of life and death over an entire county. And in a few minutes, he'll be dead on the floor of his own jail cell, killed by the very brotherhood of vigilantes that made him. This is the story of John Larn, the lawman who was really an outlaw wearing a tin star, and the secret society that built him up then tore him apart. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is the place where we dig up the forgotten corners of the Old West. The men history barely remembers, but whose stories are every bit as wild as the legends you already know. John Larn isn't a household name. He's not Billy the Kid. He's not Wyatt Earp. But in the 1870s, out on the Texas frontier, there were few men more feared, or more respected, at least on the surface, than Sheriff John Larn of Shackelford County. Here's what made Larn so dangerous. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He built a life that looked from the outside like the American frontier dream. He owned a working cattle ranch. He married into one of the wealthiest ranching families in the region. He wore a badge and enforced the law. Neighbors tipped their hats to him on the street in Fort Griffin. And the entire time, underneath that respectable exterior, John Larn was running one of the bloodiest rustling and murder operations Texas had ever seen, burying the evidence and the witnesses wherever he pleased. Riding at his side through almost all of it was a man named John Selman, a name that would later carry its own dark reputation across 2 states. Together, these 2 men would terrorize an entire county, hide behind a vigilante organization created to protect the very people they were robbing, and eventually push their luck so far that the noose, or in Larn's case, the rifle, came looking for them. Before we get into it, if stories like this are your kind of thing, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging up stories like John Larn's, men history left behind but shouldn't have. Now, let's talk about how a drifter from Alabama became the most feared rancher in Shackelford County, and how he ended up dying in chains in the very jail he used to run. We don't know much about John Larn's early years, and that's frustrating, because the man he became makes you wish there were more records. Most historians place his birth around 1849, somewhere near Mobile, Alabama. Beyond that, the trail goes cold, at least until he starts heading west, and trouble seems to follow him the entire way. According to Old West historian Leon Metz, Larn drifted out of Alabama and into Colorado, where he allegedly killed a cattleman in a dispute over a borrowed horse. Then, only a couple of months later, he's said to have shot a sheriff who tried to place him under arrest. Other accounts move that second killing down to Santa Fe, New Mexico instead. The details shift depending on who's telling the story, and there's no hard evidence tying Larn conclusively to either killing. What we do know is this: wherever John Larn went, bodies had a habit of turning up behind him. It's not until 1870, with Larn just 21 years old, that the historical record firms up. He shows up working as a cowboy near Fort Griffin, Texas, a rough-and-tumble frontier outpost that would become the backdrop for most of his story. A year later, a local cattleman named Bill Hayes put together a large herd bound for Trinidad, Colorado, and he made a decision that would eventually cost him everything. He hired John Larn to be his trail boss. Most of what we know about that cattle drive comes from a single source, a young cowhand named Henry Comstock, who wrote about the experience years afterward in an unpublished manuscript. And by his account, this was no ordinary drive. Somewhere along the trail, Larn is said to have shot 3 Mexican men and dumped their bodies into the Pecos River, supposedly joking that he was feeding the catfish. The crew stole livestock along the way. They had an armed standoff with a patrol of soldiers sent to inspect their herd. They even turned on each other. Larn's second-in-command, a self-proclaimed desperado named Bill Bush, killed a fellow cowboy over what was reportedly a minor disagreement. Later, once they reached Colorado, Bush is believed to have killed the sheriff of Las Animas County. This was the company John Larn kept. And somehow, despite riding with a crew capable of that kind of violence, Larn still managed to maintain a public image of respectability. He returned to Texas and married the daughter of a prosperous rancher named Joe Matthews. As a wedding gift, his new father-in-law handed him roughly 500 head of cattle, enough to start a ranch of his own. Larn built that ranch on the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, about 7 miles outside of Fort Griffin. The land carried its own history. It had once been the site of Camp Cooper, a U.S. military post from the 1850s that at one point had been commanded by none other than Robert E. Lee. Larn built his ranch house using stones scavenged from the old camp's ruins. Remarkably, that house is still standing today. It's still lived in. A quiet, permanent reminder of a man whose own permanence on this earth would turn out to be far shorter. If Larn had spent as much energy raising cattle as he did stealing them, he might have lived a long, quiet life in that stone house. He didn't get the chance, because it was right around this time that he crossed paths with a man who would become his partner in crime for the rest of his short life, John Selman. If that name sounds familiar, it should. This is the same John Selman who would go down in history years later as the man who shot John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head. We've covered Selman's story in a separate video. Links up on screen if you want the full picture. But for now, just know this. Selman was a natural-born killer, every bit as dangerous as Larn, and just as comfortable taking what wasn't his. The two of them didn't waste any time putting that shared talent to use. Their first target? Bill Hayes, the very same rancher who had trusted Larn enough to make him trail boss. Here's how the betrayal played out. Bill Hayes was struggling to sell his cattle up in Trinidad, and with branding season fast approaching back home in Texas, he made a fateful decision. He granted John Larn power of attorney over the remaining herd back at Fort Griffin, trusting his old trail boss to look after his interests while he was away. Larn didn't look after anything. He simply rebranded Hayes' cattle as his own and folded them into his growing ranch. When Hayes finally made it back to Texas and discovered what had happened, he was, understandably, furious. He and his brother assembled another herd, and when the time came to drive it north, they rode straight for Larn's ranch and took back every head of cattle that had once been theirs. It should have ended there, a rancher simply reclaiming stolen property. Instead, Larn turned the tables completely. He obtained an arrest warrant against Hayes, courtesy of a local constable named Riley Carter, and organized his own posse, including notably more than a dozen Buffalo soldiers, to hunt Hayes down. They caught up with the Hayes herd in December of 1873 at a place called Bushnab in Throckmorton County. What happened next wasn't an arrest, it was a massacre. According to historian Robert DeArmond, the eyewitness accounts of that night are murky and contradictory. But the only first-hand report we have comes from a Lieutenant Turner, who documented the event for his military superiors. He wrote that when the 4 men camped at Bushnab spotted the approaching posse, they reached for their weapons and opened fire. In the return volley, 2 men were killed instantly. The other 2 were shot down trying to flee. But that wasn't the end of it. 4 additional cowboys were out tending the herd that night, and Larn's posse hunted them down too, killing them under the same convenient justification, that they'd tried to escape. 8 men dead in total. Among them, Bill Hayes, the rancher who had once trusted John Larn with his livelihood. And here's the part that should turn your stomach. An officer stationed at Fort Griffin later explained away the killings by pointing out that cattle theft was so widespread in the region that it was nearly impossible to get a local jury to convict a rustler. So, rather than bring anyone in for trial, the posse had simply decided to be judge, jury, and executioner themselves. In a fair and functioning world, John Larn and John Selman would have spent the rest of their lives behind bars for what happened at Bushnab. Instead, nothing happened to them at all. If anything, it emboldened them. Both men went on to join an organization called the Tin Hat Brigade, a vigilante committee made up of some of the most prominent, respectable citizens in the county, including at least one sitting judge. And the Tin Hats were busy. By the end of 1876, a newspaper out of Austin reported that the group had already lynched at least 11 men. That same article claimed 4 more men were on their way to what the paper chillingly called the Merciful Village, a euphemism for the hangman's noose. It was Larn's association with this vigilante brotherhood that catapulted him into real political power. In April of 1876, riding the reputation the Tin Hat Brigade had built for him, John Larn was sworn in as sheriff of Shackelford County. The fox wasn't just guarding the hen house anymore. The fox had been handed a badge, a salary, and the full authority of the law. He wouldn't hold on to either the badge or his life for very much longer. But in the meantime, Sheriff John Larn used his new authority exactly the way you'd expect. According to Leon Metz, the real trouble began with a rancher named Bryant, who had a small herd running alongside Larn's cattle on shared range. One day, Bryant turned up dead, killed by one of Larn's own ranch hands. Suspicion immediately fell on Larn. The timing was too convenient and the motive too obvious. But Bryant had no family or friends willing to push for an investigation, so Larn simply folded Bryant's cattle into his own herd and considered the matter closed. It was Bill Hayes all over again, except this time Larn was the one wearing the badge that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of crime. Ranchers weren't the only ones who needed to watch their backs around Sheriff Larn. Sometime in 1877, Larn hired a pair of stonemasons to build a rock fence at his ranch. When the job was finished and it came time to pay them, Larn had them shot instead. Their bodies surfaced a few days later, floating in the Clear Fork River. The local coroner, who conveniently happened to be a member of the Tin Hat Brigade himself, refused to rule the deaths a homicide. As sheriff, Larn was, by most accounts, effective at the job on paper. Men were still being shot and hanged across the county, but most of that violence was carried out by the vigilantes, not the sheriff's office directly. Though exactly how much overlap there was between the two is nearly impossible to untangle. What we do know is that on at least one occasion, Larn personally handed a firearm to a fellow vigilante the night before 2 men were found hanging from a tree the following morning. He also brought John Selman onto his staff as a deputy, though even that detail is disputed among historians. What isn't disputed is that the 2 men were now operating with something close to official sanction, spending long stretches of time out at Larn's ranch surrounded by a rotating cast of hardened gunmen, men like Billy Bland and Charlie Reed, both fellow members of the Tin Hat Brigade. It was Bland and Reed who, on the night of January 17, 1877, rode into Fort Griffin roaring drunk and shooting up the town. Eventually, the 2 men stumbled into the Beehive Saloon. Not long after, one of Larn's deputies, a holdover from the previous administration named Bill Kruger, arrived to deal with the disturbance, accompanied by the county attorney, a man named William Jeffries. According to Leon Metz's account, Kruger and Jeffries stepped into the saloon with their weapons already drawn. It's unclear whether Kruger ever formally ordered the men to surrender. Bland, who was in the middle of taking a shot at a hanging light fixture, turned and fired the moment he spotted Kruger's pistol pointed at him. The bullet only grazed the deputy, but it was enough to set off a full-blown gunfight inside a crowded saloon. When the smoke cleared, the toll was devastating. A young lawyer named Dan Barron, recently married, lay dead on the floor with a bullet through his forehead. A lieutenant from the 10th Cavalry named Myers was dying in a chair, shot through and slumping toward the ground. Billy Bland himself was down, rolling in agony, his eyes already glazing over in death. William Jeffries had taken a bullet through the lung but would survive. Kruger, wounded only once, would also survive. Bland's partner, Charlie Reed, slipped out in the chaos and vanished into the night. Now, you might expect a sheriff to be at least a little concerned that one of his own deputies had just been shot in the line of duty. That is not what happened. Larn's fury wasn't directed at the men who'd shot Kruger. It was directed at Kruger himself for having gunned down his friend Bland. Larn was so incensed that he resigned as sheriff in protest and cut ties with the Tin Hat Brigade entirely. That single decision cracked the vigilante brotherhood right down the middle. As best historians can piece together, Larn believed Kruger had broken an unspoken code by killing a fellow Tin Hat. Not everyone in the organization agreed with him, and things got worse when Larn and Selman started rustling even more aggressively the exact crime the Tin Hat Brigade had supposedly been formed to stamp out. The tension between the two factions grew so severe that Larn and his men stopped sleeping at the ranch altogether, choosing instead to camp out in the surrounding hills each night, wary of an attack from their former allies. Eventually, a pair of delegates from the Tin Hat Brigade rode out to negotiate. The details are thin, but the arrangement was simple enough. If Larn and his crew would cut back on the drinking and rein in the open rustling, the vigilantes would leave them alone. As a kind of peace offering, the Tin Hats even helped secure Larn and Selman positions as deputy hide inspectors for the entire county, which, given their history, was roughly the equivalent of putting a pair of wolves in charge of counting the sheep. On top of that, Larn landed a lucrative contract supplying beef to the soldiers stationed at Fort Griffin. Did any of this convince him to slow down? No, not even close. If anything, Larn and Selman ramped up their operation. This was the period when the two of them began riding at night, terrorizing the smaller ranches and homesteads across the county and running off their livestock. The raids became so widespread and so relentless that at least one regional newspaper reported homesteaders were too frightened to even tend their own crops. When one landowner finally worked up the nerve to stand up to Larn, he simply vanished and was never seen again. Eventually, the chaos grew loud enough that the Texas Rangers were called in, In February of 1878, rangers located roughly 6 stolen cattle hides dumped in the river directly behind Larn's own house, about as close to a smoking gun as this case would ever produce. And still, nothing happened. Larn and Selman were simply told to turn themselves in. And instead of surrendering, the two men rode into the nearby town of Albany and began intimidating potential witnesses. In the end, the only people willing to testify against them were the rangers themselves. And since it wasn't the rangers who had lost any cattle, the case against Larn and Selman collapsed. Both men walked free, despite having been caught red-handed with stolen property. The ranger in charge of the investigation, a man named G.W. Campbell, was livid. He wrote a formal letter to his commanding officer, warning him that the entire county was effectively rigged in Larn's favor, that as many as 80 locals were secretly part of the vigilante network and would never move against one of their own. That letter never reached its destination. The Tin Hats intercepted it, and a local judge, either a member himself or at the very least a sympathizer, wrote directly to the governor, painting Campbell as a liar and a slanderer. By May of 1878, Campbell had been relieved of his command entirely. With the law effectively neutered, Larn and Selman only grew bolder and started making enemies out of nearly everyone, including old allies from within the Tin Hat Brigade itself. A homesteader named Lancaster later swore that the pair chased him for several miles along the Clear Fork, fully intending to kill him. Then, in June of 1878, Larn set up an ambush against a respected rancher named Treadwell, a man widely believed to have exposed Larn's rustling operation to the authorities. Larn took the shot from a distance. He missed Treadwell, but killed his horse. That single missed shot turned out to be the moment everything finally came crashing down. If Larn had shown even a little restraint, a little discretion, he likely could have continued his operation for years to come. But greed had made him reckless, and recklessness was about to cost him everything. A group of desperate area ranchers made one final appeal, this time directly to Larn's father-in-law, Joe Matthews, begging the old man to intervene. Matthews tried, but even he eventually had to admit there was nothing more he could do to control the man he'd once welcomed into his family. That's when the local authorities, who had spent years conveniently looking the other way, suddenly decided John Larn and John Selman were, in fact, a problem that needed solving, and the man sent to make the arrest was none other than Bill Kruger, Larn's former deputy, the same man Larn had once turned against, who had since taken over as sheriff following Larn's resignation. Kruger's posse was made up largely of Larn's own in-laws. They waited until the morning, catching Larn outside doing the most ordinary of chores, milking his cow, and took him into custody. The accounts of that arrest differ wildly. Some say Larn handed over his weapon without a fight. Others claim he begged to be allowed back inside the house to retrieve a pistol so he could go down fighting. At least one version has him threatening to kill every man in the posse the moment he made bail. In the end, Larn made only one request, that his wife and young son be allowed to ride alongside the posse into town. The unspoken logic was clear enough. A mob was far less likely to lynch a man with his family riding beside him. It worked. They reached the town of Albany without incident. Once there, a blacksmith shackled Larn and chained him to the floor of the small jailhouse, the very same office he had once commanded as sheriff. His wife, Mary, immediately set off for Fort Griffin to find him a lawyer. But by that point, it's doubtful any lawyer could have saved him, because nobody involved was actually planning on John Larn getting a day in court. That simply wasn't how the Tin Hat Brigade did business. Around midnight on June 24, 1878, the vigilantes came calling. The original plan, according to most accounts, was to drag Larn out of the jail and hang him outside, the way the Tin Hats had dealt with so many others before him. But there was a problem. Larn was still chained to the floor. Rather than waste time cutting through the shackles, the mob simply raised their rifles and opened fire through the bars. John Larn died right there on the floor of his own jailhouse, still in chains at just 29 years old. One of the guards on duty that night later said Larn met his end without flinching, that he actually smiled at the men gunning him down and took every shot without so much as a wince. Across the street, his wife Mary heard the gunfire from her hotel room. She likely knew, in that instant, exactly what it meant. The next day, she brought her husband's body home to the ranch on the Clear Fork and buried him right beside their infant son. He remains there to this day, on the same land where he once built a life out of stolen cattle and old military ruins. As for John Selman, he got out just in time. Warned of his impending arrest by a woman known locally as Hurricane Minnie, he fled the county entirely, eventually heading a gang of outlaws in New Mexico known as Selman's Scouts. Years later, he'd resurface with a badge of his own in El Paso, Texas, and on August 19, 1895, he stepped up behind the notorious John Wesley Hardin in a saloon and shot him in the back of the head. Selman himself wouldn't survive much longer. Less than a year later, he was gunned down by Deputy U.S. Marshal George Scarborough, just a block from the very spot where he'd killed Hardin. Two men, cut from the exact same cloth, a badge in one hand and a smoking gun in the other. And in the end, both of them died the same way they'd lived, violently and not entirely surprised by it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the short, brutal life of Sheriff John Larn, do me a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment letting me know who you'd like to see covered next. There are dozens of these forgotten frontier stories still out there, but I'm not stopping anytime soon. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay safe out there on the frontier.